Glad to be here. Des, how are you doing?
Good, yourself?
I'm doing great. I'm doing great. If you don't mind, I'd love to embarrass you and give a little bit more of an introduction just for folks who may not be tracking you super closely. Des is,
sure.
of course,
I'm also laughing at the difference in the photo you presented and the state of me today. I would have shaved you. Sorry.
We'll update it for the next one, man. So Des is the co-founder and chief strategy officer of Intercom. And as Dion was mentioning, Intercom helped define modern in-app chat and is now redefining what AI-first customer support can look like. And under Des's leadership, Intercom was one of the first to fully commit to an autonomous AI agent. It's part of what we're going to be talking about in a few minutes. And they've been pushing what's possible for an agent in production. Also want to point out that Des is an active angel investor. Des, I think everybody says that, but his portfolio includes companies like Stripe, Miro, and Notion. So the real deal on that side as well. And he's a leading voice in all things product startups and the future of AI-powered software. So sorry to embarrass you, Des, but with that, we're going to unpack this real experience of what it's like to use AI to build and scale an autonomous AI agent. And then we're going to have a conversation about what it means for software teams and for coding and for the industry more broadly. So let's dive in. Des, you've talked a bunch about just the shift that you went through from an initial prototype that you did really early to scaling this thing into production. And I wonder, just to kick things off, if you could just share what you learned about that journey from an impressive boardroom demo to actually using this for real.
Yeah. The biggest thing we learned is AI building product in the age of AI is extremely different. That's it in a nutshell, and I'll unpack that now. So we had many different impressive demos of Finn, which is our AI agent for customer support. The problem with most of them, the story goes something like ChatGPT launches November 30th. By December, we had versions of AI features in our inbox. We were the first people to basically build OpenAI GPT features into our product.
Wow.
We had the first prototypes of Finn in January, but this was on GPT 3.5. We couldn't kind of safeguard against hallucinations. So what we could do at the time was give you a really impressive demo as long as we could control what you said, and it looked great and it performed well as long as you didn't put it into production. And I think for what's worth, I think there are still many AI companies figuring this out.
I was going to say, sounds familiar.
Yeah. It was really when GPT-4 dropped was the beginning of like, oh well, we can actually control this. We were able to safeguard. We have like this pretty robust torture test of all the things you don't want a customer support agent to do. You don't want it to give the wrong answer. You don't want it to make up an answer. You don't want it to take an opinion that it shouldn't take, whether it's political or about the world. You don't want it to recommend your competitors. There's so many things you would never allow a human to do before we even get into like the fine tuning of like, ooh, let it speak in my brand's tone of voice. Like they're all kind of nice to have. But it was really only when 4 dropped, which was March, that we were able to release a fully autonomous agent that actually you could put in front of your support team. And that was like the best thing I could say that we learned was like AI product is just fundamentally different in that the average software development life cycle goes something like talk to customers, a bit of research, go off into the forest, wireframe some stuff up, come back, start building, run a beta test, ship it, we're good, and if it's used, even better. And the AI software development life cycle is a lot more like brainstorm about all the things that might be possible, try, see if you can get it working in a sort of internal pilot, then commit to building it, build it for real, hope to God it works in the wild. Once it's live, you have to test the hell out of it anyway, because we have like 30,000 customers. So if there's edges or wrinkles in Finn, they're going to find it. And then you kind of are after that, you're in this like constant process of iteration. So like when we launched Finn, I think it was resolving maybe 25% of our customers' support conversations. Today, it's doing about 58, 59%. That's been an entire process of improving Finn behind the scenes based on what we see in the wild. And so it's like every single thing you assume about software is usually would have hinged on this idea of working in time boxed or scope boxed chunks. It's all out the window. Everything is different in AI.
Well, first of all, Des, I'd love to see the torture test. I imagine that's not something you make public, but oh my God, it sounds fascinating.
We don't, but you could imagine, it's like if you're trying to do it yourself, like let's say you're trying to do one for Tesla or for any of your customers, I would say to you, like, there are like 3 or 4 categories of things, like show me the last 20 hard questions that your frontline support couldn't answer. They'll go in. Show me the 10 most common questions. They'll go in. Then let's talk about like security conscious, like, you know, like as in you don't want to get prompt injected or anything like that. So you'll have a set for that. And then you're into like where, like, you know, what happens with a sales conversation? Do you want your customer support like leaning in or leaning out? What happens with something that isn't answered in the docs, but is nearly answered in the docs? So you have to kind of make it. There's only a few of these you should make up, but you can pretty, I mean, we encourage our customers to do this all the time because they say, oh, we want to evaluate you and a load of agents. And we're like, okay, that's cool. But the fallacy or the worst evaluation we ever see is, I asked you and I asked Zendesk how to reset my password, and you both got it right. And I'm like, cool. That's like asking me and Einstein what's 2 + 2, and then concluding we're both great mathematicians. You know, the actual differences show on the edge. We earn our money in the hard cases, not the easy cases. So I would say to anyone, and this is true for all of you, not even if you're buying CS agents, but actually as you're trying to demonstrate superiority in agents, you have to like be able to teach your customers how to understand the difference.
So sort of related to this, clearly the torture test plays a really big role in deciding whether a particular iteration of Fin is ready for prime time. What are sort of the other indications that you've achieved production readiness in a probabilistic environment? Like, how do you quantify this? How do you get to the point where you feel like this thing's ready?
Yeah, there's 2 other sort of product market fit type things. One is like, it's a very obvious one, but just like some sense of, does anyone give a shit? So like, so in the case of like Fin answering questions, of course everyone cares, and if it does a good job, that's great. It's more all the stuff we build around the edges of Fin. So we build a whole test suite where you can like have do batch testing or like do deep testing of specific scenarios. Or we're about to launch a very, very cool new product next Wednesday, which is all around analysis of your customer support conversations. But you are looking for 2 things with these types of releases that are not like where the answer isn't that percentage goes up. You're looking for frequent engagement and like meaningful outcomes. So a lot of what we build is like it's supposed to help people get the most out of our product. So what we look at is, do they use it a lot? And then if they do, does it actually change their behavior? Ultimately, Fin is about getting you to like 100% AI resolutions, or as close as. We don't really believe you're going to get to 100. But if so, like what we look to do is like, hey, since we released that, has behavior gotten better or worse? So that's one thing. And the reason that sounds like I mean, that probably is at some abstract level true for all software, but just the mindset shift you have to have when you're building an agent is that you're trying to build something to do a job completely. So then you have to build all the peripheral software that helps you manage the agent, or helps your customers manage that agent, so that they can get it to do the job completely, and so that they can actually score it and say it's doing a good job or a bad job. Would they hire it or fire it? Would it get a promotion? Would it be on a PIP? You kind of have to equip your customers to understand all that. The other thing I'd say is agent behavior. Like basically, you can imagine in the wild world of support, you have like the Four Seasons has a different customer support policy to say like EasyJet or Ryanair or Southwest, depending on your budget airline, wherever you live, right? Like some and like basically different brands have different basically different LTVs of their customers, or they value their customers in different ways. So every time you bump into one of these sort of vectors of differentiation within your sort of customer set, you then have to create effectively preferences or settings for how the agent should behave. Now, a common thing people do is they say, oh, that's okay, we're just gonna have one big ass prompt box and they can just write in everything they want. And that sounds really good, but it's impossible to maintain. Your customers are not prompt engineers. There's a right way to tell somebody to be quick and efficient, and there's a bad way to do it. And like, if you expose like a kind of raw prompt to all your customers all the time, you'll get some bad behavior. Like it's every time you're giving your customer a large text area and saying some version of describe the behavior you want, you're kind of handing them a very sharp knife and crossing your fingers a little bit. So you end up having to distill these things down into sort of, ultimately you end up designing the feature, not just being like, a la carte, you tell us what you want. It's almost like the Henry Ford thing. It's just slightly different. Customers want different things. It's your job to like identify the common traits of those things. So to give you one simple example, in Fin, we special case things like tone of voice, and we special case things like answer length, because there's a right way to tell Claude or to tell Fin, hey, here's the length of answer we want, and there's a stupid way. And so you could say, be really short, and what you'll get is a very rude agent. So you have to like kind of help your customers. But I do notice there's a tendency with startups to say, you can, here's a big text box, go nuts, and customers do go nuts, and then they think your product sucks. So that's the other aspect, is just make sure that you've kind of paved the common desire paths of behavior so that the customers don't have to work it all out themselves.
And how does that, I haven't been on the other side of your product. How does that manifest? Is it like documentation you give your customers, or is the customization UI sort of set up so that they can't get off the happy path? How do you do that?
It's the latter. So we do, we just give you like literal, buttons that say like, what tone of voice do you want or whatever. And we recommend, like, we have a feature called guidance where you can add in your extra stuff on top. An example would be like, maybe like Airbnb wants to refer to their guests as like patrons, and maybe they want to refer to landlords a certain way, or like, there's things like that. But the way in which we've built Finn, that's it's important where you apply that to the answer. You should generate the answer first, and then follow the guidance to adapt the answer to meet the requirements of words or verbiage or whatever. However, if you kind of like let it go in raw, you'll set yourself up in a bad way. So ultimately what Finn is we know all the common things that companies differ on, and we give you all the options and preferences you need for that. And then there's an after the fact sort of, now, if you've any weird special rules, like maybe you call yourselves Teslians or something like that, we'll deal with that. Yeah, brilliant, exactly. We'll deal with that after, once we've generated a nice, concise answer that's humorous and happy, and it references these materials and that. Once we've got all that done, then let's apply your, frankly, like slightly less important stuff.
Yeah. I had this existential moment, Des, listening to you, where we were talking about how do you sort of coax the LLMs to do just the right thing, and then we shifted to how do you coax humans to do just the right thing.
Yeah. It's funny that conversation comes up a lot. Like I was discussing, so we have this feature called tasks where you can basically tell Finn, hey, here's how we do a refund, and people measure it. We care a lot about the reliability of these steps in a task, because like if something's only 90% reliable and you daisy chain 3 of those steps in a row, you're down to like an unperformance thing. This sort of probability gap or whatever, compound. What's interesting is they're like, I had a customer say to me, how do you get like these like slightly ineffective or slightly inefficient things to like work together, still deliver a required outcome? And I was like, have you ever been a manager? That's literally what it is. Like, Johnny's hungover, Debbie didn't show up, we still need the system to work. Like the nature of companies is there are ways to get these slightly unreliable agents to do things predictably and deliver some sort of common, consistent service to the world,
Well, I think this is interesting time to talk about more of the interaction between the agent and humans. Let's sort of start out with, you talked about the success rate getting now, I think, to 58, 59%, which is, for those keeping track, I think is like a 10% boost since the last time we talked some time ago, like 9 months ago or whatever. What are the signals you look for when it's clear that you have to engage a human in the conversation? Do you just sort of, like when I deal with some online service providers, I won't mention names, I feel like I have to type agent.
Human.
How do you do it?
I mean, like, the shortest answer is we actually ask you, hey, did this answer your question? And that's the most obvious. If somebody says anything other than like a positive answer, then that's an obvious route to agent. And we look for frustration. We look for frustration might emerge in the middle of a conversation where we think we're having a back and forth, but the person is either caps locking it or whatever. There's also, like, in the guidance feature I mentioned earlier, you can have like escalation settings, like if they mention scam or like hacked or whatever, always escalate. If it sounds like the user's being compromised, if it sounds like they're worried, if it sounds like you've all sorts of, like, every type of business has a specific hot button concern. Like if you're an online gaming company, you care a lot about people who say they're feeling very down after a certain bad beat or something like that. So you have to kind of special case every one of these with the guidance feature. But we generally look for like anything that suggests that the user, even if the user just starts a new conversation straight away, that's another negative sign. Anything that looks basically like wasn't a positive conclusion would be the beginning of a path to escalate. But to be clear, our default wouldn't be to immediately hand over to human, because that's not what customers want or what our customers want. What it will be is to ask, do you want to talk to a human? And then you'll say yes, and then you'll get over it. Because sometimes people will just go silent while they're clicking around the screen, and you don't want to be like, all right, here's John, he's going to solve your problem, like, because they're actually halfway through whatever answer you gave them. So
And I imagine different customers of yours have different thresholds for how much they might be willing to sort of, I don't want to say antagonize, but sort of wait until they do the escalation to the human.
Absolutely. And they have different, like, they're kind of like different everything, honestly. Customers, I think customer service, a lot of folks don't respect it enough for how nuanced it is as a domain. I think it's one of these situations where if you work in one customer support org that might have like clean and simple rules, you might therefore be misled into thinking that it's therefore a clean and simple problem domain. But in practice, what it is this extremely large superset of, like, probably hundreds of company preferences. And you have to kind of like work out a sort of happy path through all of them in your product offering. So yes, thresholds for when we should hand over, what we should hand over, how we should hand over, the delay before handing over. Do you hand over to a live agent, or do you hand over to an asynchronous follow-up? Do you want to hand over to a request to fallback, or a callback? Like, all of those things are like in the mix here. And it's, you're kind of wading through a sea of preferences.
Talking about sort of the interaction between humans and the agent a little more, I imagine the stuff that gets routed to humans becomes more and more the edge cases, becomes more and more complicated. What does the shift do for job satisfaction of the humans involved? Do they tend to like their jobs more, or does it start to feel like kind of an assembly line grind where you only get like the grubby stuff that is really no fun?
I think it depends it's kind of an issue of perspective. So I think what happens a lot is there's a few things people don't realize about customer service. One is it's a very transitional job because it's primarily entry level. So when you are thinking of a customer support agent, you should realize that almost by definition, that person is either just after starting the job or is just about to leave the job. That's
it was my first job coming into industry way back when.
Like, and that's a very common story. Like the amount of CEOs of our customers who say that they got their first start in CS or whatever. So it is like there's a tendency to be like, no, preserve those jobs. And it's kind of like that age-old argument of like, if we forced the construction companies to dig with spoons, we'd have more jobs, but it wouldn't be good jobs. Like, there's a reason why we invent technology and we try to move faster and better. So I think what we see is, in practice, when you apply Fin and you get the 56% reduction, a few things happen. Like your first response time, which is a classic CS metric, that goes way faster because obviously Fin's very fast, but then your agents are less burdened as well, so they get a lot faster. Your average handling time, which is the previous sort of measure, again, an incumbent measure, that goes way up because your humans are only dealing with really hard stuff now. They're only dealing with the stuff that like wasn't in any way answered by any documents anywhere. So the complexity goes up, and ultimately what you see, the changes you see happen in a customer support org is there is sometimes it will either stay like relative to the support volume, it will get smaller, right? Or sometimes it actually shrinks itself. But certainly like what you see a lot of the time is they stop growing. The next change you see is there's a lot more specialization. So you get like, principal product specialist on a support team. And that like role is, usually higher paid, usually higher valued. There's a lot more expertise. And all of a sudden what happens is a career path emerges for customer support people where they can actually like use the fact that they've worked in this company for like 3, 4, 5 years. They really understand the product inside and out. They know all the edge cases, and now they can get paid for that because they're not spending half their day explaining how to reset passwords. They're actually putting all their time into like really high quality, like ultimately quite differentiated work. So that's the change. The other side of it is what we call like human in the loop. So the new kind of frontline support might be a bit more human approval processes. That can be a bit gruntier, grindier, like as you said, like in that, like a classic step would be like approve this refund before it goes live. And the approval is, I just want a human to eyeball this to make sure that they haven't in some way exploited the bot or whatever, right? And so that would usually look like a human going, yep, the order, yes, it's late, and yes, that's that. Okay, click. And that work, again, it's like not, it's there because there's a degree of trust or human validation that the business wants to enforce, and that will ultimately just be a queue or an inbox that you're just jumping through. I suspect over time people will find better ways to grow more trust and confidence in agents to handle that. But that's like when you look at the sort of topology of a support team, you get a lot more specialists, a lot, frankly, fancier job titles, like and then you get people who own the agent and own the intelligence, because all these other changes happen. Like your documentation is now like mission critical infrastructure because it's literally how your support works.
Yeah.
So all of a sudden you really care about that being really good and really reliable and really up to date, and it's worth investing in it. You've got people who own the automations for things like refunds or flight changes or baggage routes or whatever. Like whatever your business is, you have to have somebody who's in charge of Fin, if you like. So I think a lot of things change, but there's definitely an optimistic take here, which is like if you've ever seen, like you mentioned you started it. If you ever seen where these kind of like call centers look like, or where these live chat centers look like, it is not the job that like there's a kind of a temptation to be like, oh no, protect them and keep them in their factories, they'll be happy there. I think that's the wrong way to think about it. I think another argument is offer a really good career path from this. And yeah, maybe there's less total roles, but like if you look at humanities employment over time, we've always found stuff to do. Like I think I was joking with somebody recently where they were saying like think about what the spreadsheet did to investment banking, right? One of my friends used to joke, investment bankers used to be really busy before the spreadsheet got invented. And I'm like, all right. And it's not, they're obviously still quite busy now. The spreadsheet, like the big fear of the spreadsheet was it would kill all the bookkeepers. And in practice, when you look at the numbers, it is true that there are less bookkeepers per business now than there used to be. But are there less people employed? No. Accountancy kicked off. All these other analysts, financial analysts kicked off. All these other sectors emerged. They were like, higher order, higher value. And I think that's the sort of thing you're going to see happen. So it's not really just about a net loss in jobs to my mind. It's about there is displacement. I don't want to lie about that. I can't be sitting here saying we're doing 56% and also there's no change. There will be some changes, but I think there'll be, in a load of cases, remarkably positive changes.
Am I right to maybe even fantasize a little bit about new kind of high leverage jobs of the future where you have support agents, humans, who are kind of looking at what the agents are doing and sort of planning strategy and seeing new patterns emerge and sort of strategically engaging to sort of control this fleet of agents? I mean, that seems like a really cool job.
Well, and like that's coming, like as in, I wasn't going to like try and pitch anything, but like tomorrow week in London, we're literally having an event where we're launching the first product in that line of thinking, where you have a kind of a dashboard for seeing what's going on. And based on that, you can then make decisions about what else do I need to tell Fin, how can I equip Fin, etc. Can't say too much about it because we haven't launched yet, but like,
this is not actually a clumsy sort of like pitch moment. This is like totally organic. This is so cool, man.
Yeah, it's like, but I think that there is an interesting thread we've been pulling that a lot of your guests, or sorry, your viewers might be interested in, which is it's one thing to like agentify a job, whether it's like, a coder, whether it's marketing copy, whether it's an SDR, whether it's customer support. The next thing you have to do is build all the surrounding tooling for the person whose job it is to set that up. So like, just to make this not a pitch, let's just say if we take something like sales representative, like person who does sales live chat. If you nail that with an agent, that can really be a really persuasive sort of chat with a website visitor to sell them on a product. That's cool. The first thing your customers are going to ask is this working? How do I make it better? How do I improve it? How do I see what's going on so I can get better answers? And all of a sudden you have to build this like agent operating platform, which is like, you're kind of like your heads up display for what the hell's going on.
Yeah.
If so like there are all these like peripheral tools that go around the agent, which by the way, as a side note, is why it kills me whenever anyone gets into the discussion about thin wrappers or any of that. I'm just like, you don't realize how much software you have to build to like handle 50, 60, 70% of the support of a large company,
Yeah, totally, man. So looking at time, I think we have another 12 minutes or so before the end of the session. So if any of you have questions to ask, go ahead and just enter the questions. We've got a team monitoring, and I'll interrupt the conversation to take your question, and Des will answer it. In the meantime, I'm just going to keep jamming with Des, and we'll keep going. So I want to pivot a little bit because in addition to the product you're building, I can't wait to see what you announce. That sounds amazing. I just wonder if you could give us some insights on how you use AI code gen tools at Intercom. Like, are you using like tools like Bolt and Replit and Lovable and V0 and the like, or do you just sort of stick with sort of more sort of autocomplete type stuff? What is your stack, and what learnings do you have to share?
So we're about 500 people in R&D, maybe 100 in marketing. That's the areas where I know we have deployed AI mostly. All of our engineers by default are like Cursor or Windsurf. On top of that, we've layered on Claude Code is another common one. I think a lot of our AI group use that. And then like for what to me, like all of that is like perhaps slightly closer to the autocompletes. What I would say is most interesting for me is things like, say, Lovable as an alternative to Figma. So as an example, very related to the feature I just described, data visualization is extremely annoying to build out in Figma or any sort of design tool. Yeah. Like if you want to build like dynamic, adaptive, like, hey, understand these 25 conversations and plot sentiment on a bar chart or blah, blah. It's extremely wasteful to have like designers dragging and dropping various sized rectangles in a row or any version of that, right? And it's actually quite rewarding to think about Lovable or any of the equivalents, Create or V0 or whatever. If you think about them more as a wireframing tool than a final product tool in this exact case for a second, you can get really far by saying, right, we need to design a data visualization for a certain type of product or for a certain, like how would you visualize all of the most common topics and what the most frequent questions in those topics are? How would you visualize that? And you might say, oh, we could do like a tag cloud or a bubble diagram, or we could do like just a tree map, or like there are like loads of different ones. Now, right, like if we go back to 2021 or 2022 before ChatGPT drops, what actually happens there is people either start sketching or whiteboarding, or they wasted a lot of time dragging squares and circles around in a browser to try and visualize these ideas. We can now kind of explore the solution space for all possible visualizations realistically in like maybe 2 hours of just prompting, right? 2 hours of good prompting will get you like 10 or 12 different ideas that you can then look at and flick through and be like, which one of these makes sense? You can even feed it real data. And it, because it'll work, because it's actually live code. It's not like a perfectly dragged square. And you can look at these things and be like, huh, I think item number 4 is up. And you can kind of pull a thread on that. Well, let's add some drop downs. What pickers would we need? What filters would we need? And you're doing all this. These are all design things. You're doing it in like a proper prototyping tool in Figma. Sorry, not in Figma, although Figma as of last week's releases might be relevant here. But like certainly V0, both Lovable, or whatever. And you can kind of like, I often say, explore the solution space, which is like try out 10 different things and then exploit. So then when you've picked your version, you can then move into a different type of prompting, which is extremely deep refinement, which is where you can get to apply like, either like specific UI constraints or like art direction for the aesthetics or whatever. And you can get it a lot closer. You can give it all like the elements of your own UI. Like here's the typography we use. Here's our icon setting. It will work all that out as well. And then you can actually look at something that's a lot closer. Again, before we've asked an engineer to write a line of code, we can then be looking at something that's way closer. That's something you can then sit with an engineer and like you've kind of saved what could have honestly in the olden days been, weeks, if not months of like various different explorations and workshopping. You've reduced it to like a day, 2 days, 3 days sort of thing. And that's probably, for my mind, the single most impactful change that you should see in your software development lifecycle when you're properly AI enabled is the ability to explore and exploit should shrink from like weeks to like hours. Oh, cool. And if you do that right, because like I think I often hear engineers say this, like writing code as in like the fingers on keyboard piece is not the hard part. The hard part is you start building one thing and the designer changes their mind and the PM says, nope, sorry, that feature has to go in. And then if you had known that, you would have built it a different way. Like the whole process can be quite messy, but you can figure out so much extra shit in advance if you do proper prototyping.
Thank you for that. I want to come back to that with a question, but first I want to get to Martin Bishop's question. So Martin Bishop, thanks for your question. He asks, how much impact do you see when you change the underlying models?
So I would say up to like 25 to 50%, 57% or whatever today's figure is. I think like honestly only like 2 or 3% of that is attributable to like various different models. Like it's not massive. We partnered with Anthropic because we believe we have the best partnership with them and they had the best models as per our torture test. But I think Fin is like it's not like a single shot agent. It's a subsystem of about 15 different processes. There's like a process for disambiguating. There's a process where, there's like obviously chucking, re-ranking, summarizing. Then there's like the heart of Fin. When you've sourced all, you've performed your RAG, you've done all of that. At the very heart is then this idea of answer this question. I think we have experimented with, say, open source ones. We've experimented with DeepSeek, etc. They're all slightly worse than our current setup. That's the result of doing like hundreds of A/B tests to perfect our current setup. But I think the agent, like say the actual model itself, is not as high a unit of leverage versus the actual, say, the agent architecture. That's a thing that we saw a lot of win in. So I think we're on our third major architecture of Fin at this point. Every one of them has been significant in terms of improvement to like the resolution rate. Prompts probably second, and then there's other like slightly peripheral things that aren't the pure AI stuff. Like so, our RAG engines is bespoke. Our re-ranker is bespoke. These are all things that we've actually perfected specifically for what we do. Some of this is because we happened to have we had a previous AI product, so we had a lot of these things ready to go already pre-tuned. And of course, back in the old days, you really had to tune them because the performance was so tough to get. So yeah, I think I'd say, like, you know, a lot of people think like, hey, like DeepSeek dropped, why isn't Fin going up or whatever? And we're like, well, because that's not where the meat of the problem is, you know.
I'm imagining like you've sort of built a proprietary vertically specific reasoning model on top of whatever underlying LLM you have. And because of that, like all these other things are just very, very incremental to the reasoning you've built in.
Yeah, and that's not to say that they're insignificant. Like we fight for every one of these %, if you know what I mean.
Yeah,
but
totally.
But you are correct, yeah.
Interesting. So next question, Radhika asks, could AI coding tools be useful for less experienced developers to write more efficient and scalable code? That's an interesting one.
Yeah, I can't say this for sure. I can just give my opinion. I think the degree to which you can, you know, you're like one area I think a lot of teams don't spend enough time in is like before you know, AI happened, we already had an R&D operations team, and one of the things they spent a lot of time optimizing was our developer environment. So we care a lot about this, and we had a team who focused on this already. I think when AI happened, a thing a lot of companies do is just like, hey, like, you know, someone posts in Slack, hey, you should all go and check out Cursor. Anyway, back to work. And I think if you really want to get results, you need to kind of take a stronger opinion. So that looks like things like writing your, you know, as Gene, who was on the previous speaker, was saying, like, write your rules file or your Claude.md or whatever, like explain exactly the type of code you want. To some degree, it's also a function of, is your existing code base coherent, like, you know, high cohesion, low coupling, blah, blah, blah. Like, is it easy? You know, but so I would posit to Radhika's question, like, my suspicion is if your code base is pretty easy to learn and pretty easy to work with, what you'll find is like AI coding tools will be great for accelerating a new person's ability to contribute. If your code base is, let's just say, older, contains multiple different versions, has lots of different like libraries, you know, you're mixing all sorts of various generations of software together, then the chances are no, is my experience. And I think the challenge then becomes like, should you consider, like, you know, ultimately like rewriting parts of your product, like the core engines where you need to do most of your improvement? Should you think about rewriting from a point of view of getting them into shape so that the AI tools can help? That's the kind of a big question for a lot of orgs that they're facing right now. And it's worth asking, even though no one likes to say the rewrite word, but you have to bear in mind, like, your competitors who were started in the last 6 months, who were like born in some YC garage somewhere, they have none of your tech debt, they have none of your legacy bullshit. They're going to have the freedom to build all this stuff like natively in AI from the get-go. So no matter, you might think it's an advantage that you've got 7 years of coding and a 7 year of product work behind you. What they see is, we're going to take 5 screenshots, feed it all to Claude, and tell it to write it using the latest and greatest, and we'll have all the features that you have now. And we got them in 2 weeks, and the AI knows how to improve on them. Does your AI know how to improve on it? And these are slightly existential, scary questions, but I think you have to kind of ask them to get proper kind of like situational awareness of what you're facing.
We have like a minute left, and I see this question. Let me just parse it for a second. Okay, yeah, maybe we can do this in like a minute or less, Des.
Sure.
Like, how are customers receiving Fin? Like, do you see customers being concerned with job loss and other things, or are people embracing the cost savings with open arms?
There's categories. So we 5,000 customers or so. Revenues in like the tens of millions. It's growing very fast. Like the general response is it's a glass of ice water to somebody in hell, because a lot of customer support teams are extremely underwater. So the very second they turn on Fin, they kind of get their breath back and they can get through the backlog, and they're now finally their heads above water. That was Anthropic's experience when they started using it. They like, that's the actual quote they gave us. They're like, it was the first time we actually got down to inbox zero in a customer support org. So that's one reaction. And in those cases, it's not like they're not thinking, oh great, now we can right size our support team. They're thinking, finally we can kind of get a handle on things. So that's a very genuine reaction. Sometimes if there's like a BPO, a business process outsource firm involved, their contract might not get renewed on the far side of all this. That's just natural. Like, they were brought in as a temporary thing. They leave as a temporary thing. In terms of our customers, some of the funniest reactions we see are things like a human takes over the conversation, and we'll see somebody say, sorry, I was actually doing grand with Finn. Could you put me back to Finn, please? And it's not that Finn's brilliant so much as they don't like the idea that they're bothering a human. It would be like as if you knew there was a human behind ChatGPT doing all the lookups based on what you said, you'd feel a lot more sympathy, and you'd be like, well, you know what, I don't need to bother you anymore. So there's a thing where people like the idea that there's a bot there to answer every question that they might otherwise have to look up,
Yeah, absolutely. Des, you've been so generous with your time. You stayed up late. You're here local in European time, UK time. Thank you so much for your time. This has been a really fun conversation for me.
I enjoyed it too, Ben. Thanks a lot. And thanks to everyone else who came along. Take care.